You're watching GearWire.com, and I'm Owen O'Malley, and we're here with Vincent van Haaff, who is the head of Waterland Design. Vincent, thanks for taking time with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And so, what does your company do? What's your mission statement? What's your focus?
Waterland was established early on when I came to the United States, around the mid-70s. And I sort of took a name that I had already adopted in Holland, where I'm from originally. Building gear for bands, loudspeaker systems, and fixing up people with rehearsal spaces and those kind of things while I was going through architecture school. And I took that concept with me, and of course came to a virtual heaven here in Los Angeles, where recording studios abound. And in that era, that was really the start and the advent of the recording studio scene here. There were a few designers that actually made the grade. There was a guy called Tom Hidley, who is now back in Europe. Already in New York, we had the very well-known John Storick, who did Electric Lady. And actually, from the technical aspects that were concentrated on in the recording studio design, an acoustical and architectural design of recording studios, all of a sudden the aesthetics became important. And so the integration of the aesthetics, the acoustics, which were driven essentially by the improvement in loudspeakers, gear, materials availability, experimentation. We got all of a sudden to a higher step, a higher level of environment for recording. Record Plant in New York was one of those experimenters, you could say, and from there on there was really an avalanche what actually developed here in Los Angeles.
So, what would you say, sort of as a studio designer, what was your first major design that you worked on?
The first independently designed studio was a little place called Rusk Sound on La Brea Avenue, right up the street from what at that time was A&M Records. It's now called Hanson. The next major design was Conway Recording in a little further east down Melrose Avenue. And that was really, I got a free slate to design Conway, and that's now expanded out to, I guess, 3 major world-class rooms, I'm proud to say.
Yeah. So your formal training was in architecture primarily.
Correct. I studied architecture and specialized at one point in theater design, just because I came from that era where we were all sitting around. A guitar amplifier was a lot more important than a drafting table, in fact, So I adopted to my class, my generation. Yeah. And of course, theater design, live concerts were big things in my generation. Live performance theater, and theater as well. I mean, just the actual staging of plays and things like that. I was very fascinated with how that could actually change the world. I mean, that's all that we wanted to do in those days.
So, did you have any formal study in acoustics, or
I studied for a little while at IRCAM, which is a French research laboratory in Paris. And then I went to film school for a little while in London, and realized that I had this weird idea that I wanted to become a cameraman. I lugged around a fairly heavy 16mm Eclair camera for a while, and I always would see the guy with the microphone behind me going, "Oh God, that's such a great job." So I got into splicing tape and editing from the Nagra. It was a lot more fun than trying to develop film. And this was obviously the time before video actually came in. That culminated in working in a recording studio, taking some classes at conservatory in Amsterdam in musicology and music composition and all those kind of things. And then one very lucky day, I met a filmmaker who said, in Amsterdam, on some cafe terrace in the summertime, I met this gentleman, David Weissman, and he said, "Oh, I have a friend in New York. He's working with Stevie Wonder. Why don't you just go take a look?" And I literally, like 3 days later, was on the plane to meet with Robert Margouleff, who was one of the Robert Margouleff and Malcolm Cecil, who were the producers of albums like Inner Visions and Talking Book. So I mean, amazingly, unbelievably lucky, as taking that back to when I came to California, and got to work in a recording studio for a couple of years as an apprentice and a gopher and a patch bay boy and the tea boy, as it's called in England, and then got offered to design a recording studio. Somebody found out that I could draw a little bit, and from there on, it sort of progressed and spiraled out to designing real professional recording studios. As I said, Rusk Sound, which is still in existence. Conway Recording came close afterward, and eventually I got introduced to the right people to work on Village Recorder. Then later, about 10 years later, got invited to rebuild all of A&M Studios. And that was a massive job.
Yeah,
really 2 years of, basically in-house designer and in-house architect.
Yeah. So you said that your sort of formal, I guess, acoustical or acoustic architectural designing was in theater and in live theater. So how do you think that experience has informed the way you thought about designing recording studios?
I walked into the recording studio language. That was the actual vernacular was set up by these people like Tom Hidley that I mentioned before. Another gentleman, George Augsburger, who was very influential in those days in designing loudspeaker systems, higher power systems, and more accurate. He came from a JBL background. And because most of these rooms were built into industrial spaces, they used a geometry that was very intuitive. In the first place, of course, what we all know now, the law of interior control room acoustics is no parallel surfaces. Symmetry down a center line where there is a stereo image, so that you can trust whatever you hear on the left is also wrong on the right. Then that geometry resulted in them building a ceiling system that was coming down into a point at the center, with a loudspeaker system in the front, of course above a window, and another ceiling element going back into a very heavily dampened low impedance type of trapping. They used thick blankets of fiberglass all the way around to absorb the sound energy that was pumped into the room. That's all very well, but in my theater acoustics background, I had learned that it is better to project the sound image into an open space and then diffuse and then actually scatter the sound rather than make it fall into a bag of cotton balls.
It's exactly all sounds like this,
Right, right. It's almost like the rooms were designed like big horns, like big speaker horns. Right?
Well, precisely,
Yeah.
and I just, I proud to say, I sort of turned that around,
Yeah.
and I said, now look at it here. If we actually raise the ceiling so that there is that horn effect, but in a mirror image, you will probably create a much more accurate stereo image and a wider stereo image as well. Most of these old rooms had a very narrow sweet spot.
Right. Okay.
Well, with a ceiling, still it's a fairly reflective surface, but it's not parallel to the floor. So we've achieved that non-parallelism.
Right. Right.
But it actually guides the sound in such a way that it is more like as if you're both in a telephone booth and hold your hands in front of your mouth
Right.
in this fashion and in that fashion.
So this room is kind of a great example of that right now, and I think that a lot of I think it's a good point you make about the sweet spot. I think a lot of home recording enthusiasts, amateur recordists, think that their sort of the sweet spot is entirely dependent on just the monitor system they have and the placement of those monitors. So I think it's really interesting to think about how the way they treat their room could actually affect that. And I was wondering if we could take a look at this room.
Well, yes. Yeah. So looking at this room, this is a very the amount of gear that you see here. The owner of this particular space is a great collector. I mean, my hat off, because I hadn't seen a Binson Echo Rec for 25, 30 years, and here it is. That was one of my, I've desired that piece of gear when I was in high school. But yeah, so the ceiling here actually goes up from the loudspeakers, and it tends to be so that the waveguide, in a sense, it acts like a lens, is a free space type of waveguide rather than a compression type of waveguide, which was what was those old ceilings were called compression ceilings.
Okay.
Somebody once said that this was an expansion ceiling, but it's not expansion because there's nothing expanding. It's the only thing that's expanding is sound, and sound expands, naturally. But
staying out of the way, basically. Staying out of the way.
Yeah, it's staying out of the way.
Right.
Precisely. It is not forcing sound toward your face.
Right.
It is just opening it up and leaving the loudspeaker as much of its own room. 99% of a loudspeaker's reproduction is perfectly accurate. I mean, there's, we all know about NS10, but that's a different story. We had Oratones, which was another different story. But let's say a Genelec, if you would actually measure it, it's a perfectly flat response. The only thing that makes it sound odd or distorted is the room itself. And now you take that product that you have mixed in the room into somebody's living room or into somebody's car or on headphones mostly these days.
Right.
And that room that you have mixed your product in is actually the major element that you bring into it that creates the soundscape. Accurate or not accurate, it really, but that's the filter through which everything is seen.
The listening environment is that major filter.
Right. So giving the sound the freedom to develop without there being parallel surfaces which might distort it to the point where there are nodes and unequal resonances within the room, or comb filter effects, and you can get very technical in terminology, but to actually give the sound the freedom to develop is, in my opinion, and at that time, 1975, was a much more accurate way of going about doing this.
So would you say that this design is sort of a centerpiece of your studio design philosophy in general?
Correct. Yes,
Yeah.
and it started all with Conway Recording, where the owner, Buddy Brondo, actually gave me, like I said, full reign. I explained to him by means of some of these graphical analyses. You can do ray tracing. We do it on computer these days, but in those days it was actually sitting there with a pencil and doing the angle of incidence is equal to the angle of reflection, and
Actually drafting.
actually drafting,
Right, yeah.
which I do still very much,
Yeah.
because I tend to feel like the hand is more accurate. My hand-eye coordination is better than a computer. Yeah, so I proved to him that we would be able to create an open room which has natural dispersion, natural, rather than having absorption by cotton ball,
Right.
we'd have absorption by air and natural dissipation and diffusion.
So did that change the name for? I mean, or did that change the need for that same sort of absorption in the back of the room?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, because now all of a sudden we didn't have that compressed or geometrically. Yeah, you could actually say that those ceilings had a certain amount of compression, like we use in electronics now, compression to squish everything within a certain bandwidth, and squish everything within your iPod, basically.
Right.
It's like, and well, in those days we actually did have the progressing ability to cut records. Still, a lot of records are being cut, quite literally, but with the equalization, preview, and those kind of mastering technologies that were emerging in those days, we could make records sound hotter and more dynamic. And so to expose the dynamics inside the room with the speaker was a major, well, a point of focus, because that's really what you wanted to have, the end result.
So you probably the music, the way the music, the sound of the music changed probably couldn't have happened without the room evolving to meet that.
Correct.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it's maybe a little biased.